Okay, go ahead, Rachel. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our fourth and final workshop in our Preservation Advocacy series. Oh, I'm sorry about that. We have to mute YouTube once we go live, which we now are. So again, let's start. Hello, and thank you for joining us to our fourth and final workshop in our Preservation Advocacy series, Researching Historic Properties for Landmark Nominations, with our presenters Tom Heuser and Jeff Murdock. My name is Naomi West. I'm the Director of Philanthropy and Engagement at Historic Seattle. Historic Seattle's mission is saving meaningful places to foster lively communities. Historic Seattle knows that our properties and programs occupy the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This acknowledgement is not a substitute for developing relationships with Indigenous communities or for honoring Indigenous stories as we share our collective history, but is the first step in recognizing the people whose land we occupy. Before I turn things over to our presenters today, I just want to thank our sponsors, particularly Bricklayer and Allied Craft Worker, Local 1, Alaska and Washington and Alaska, Daniels Real Estate, the Greystone and Gridiron, Selling Community Foundation, and Urban Villages in Railspur, who are making today's programming possible and free at no cost to those of you attending. I also want to thank my Historic Seattle colleagues with a special shout out for Eugenia Wu, who's our Director of Preservation Services, and Jeff Murdock, our Preservation Advocacy Manager, for their efforts in curating and coordinating today's program, as well as my colleague Taylor Roden, our Community Events Manager, who would normally be running today's program, but is setting us up for tomorrow night's From Ragtime to Jazz performance at Washington Hall. And also a thank you to Rachel Zabalza-Wynn, our Assistant Director of Philanthropy and Communications, who's helping out with today's program. Eugenia will facilitate the Q&A at the end of today's program, so please share your questions for our presenters in the chat, and we'll make sure to cover those. If you're joining us on YouTube, please put your questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll make sure to get those to our presenters as well. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a safe space for all participants, so we will not tolerate racism, sexism, homophobic comments, discrimination, insults, etc. Please be respectful of the space as an opportunity for listening, learning, and exploration. Now for our presentation, I would like to introduce Tom and Jeff, our presenters, and then we'll turn the program over to them. Tom Heuser is a historian and preservation consultant based on Capitol Hill. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from the University of Washington in 2008 and has been researching and writing about local history since 2015. He advocated for the preservation of Capitol Hill's historic places as the founding president of Capitol Hill Historical Society from 2017 to 2021, and he has worked independently as a consultant since 2019. Jeff Murdock is the Preservation Advocacy Manager at Historic Seattle. He served on the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board from 2011 to 2017, witnessing an environment in which saving historic places changed from being challenged by the deepest economic recession to the most heated real estate market in recent history. Jeff holds a Master of Architecture and a Master of Science in Architectural History and Theory degree from University of Washington, and he serves currently as the president of the board of directors for the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, which is our statewide preservation advocacy organization. So please join me in welcoming our awesome presenters, Tom and Jeff.
Thank you, Naomi. Let me see if I can make this work. All right. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is the last of Historic Seattle's four-part series on preservation advocacy. And in it, we've gone from the big picture, how to advocate for historic resources, to the workings of city and county landmark preservation programs, to the nuts and bolts of creating a nomination, to today's program on historic research. All of the other advocacy topics that we've discussed are reliant on sound and rigorous historical research. And the topics we're going to discuss today are focused on Seattle and King County, but the methods are applicable anywhere. And there are always more research sources out there. Obviously, these are the ones that we use on a regular basis, but it's certainly not an exhaustive guide. Some of the information that we're going to be looking for is listed here, from the build date of a resource to the architect, owner, original use, history, the construction methods and history, the neighborhood context, development, and social cultural history. We'll be using a variety of resources this morning or this afternoon. It's important to remember to stay organized, keep careful records for all of the research that you do. Make sure you keep your sources, make citations properly as you go. It's easy to run yourself down a rabbit hole in any of these sort of research methods, especially online. So keep careful notes as you work through your research project. This seems obvious, but it's good to start out with just a simple sound Google search of your resource, your property. You can determine whether the property actually has already been recognized as a historic resource, whether it's listed on the register or is a local landmark. And if you can find other reports that are relevant to your property, you can also find additional resources out of those nomination reports. So look for designated landmarks online. You can download the reports. Historic districts also have a lot of research that's already been done for you. City of Seattle Historic Properties Database on the landmarks or the Historic Preservation website. The Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation Wizard database is a good resource, as well as the National Register. So this is just what the Department of Neighborhoods Landmarks Preservation Program website looks like. You can find on the left-hand side down here lots of different information that can help with your research. That's a great place to sort of start and get a sort of a overview of what's already been done. This is DAP, Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. You can also search properties that have been loaded into DAP that have a lot of information on building types and architects as well. And once you start your research, I recommend downloading this report, Researching the History of Seattle and King County Buildings. It's a document, PDF about 50 pages long that Seattle Public Library has compiled. You can find it on their Special Collections website, and it has a lot of the information that we'll be discussing today that kind of lays out how to do this research. So starting with basic property information, you need to find the owner, information about the site, purchases and sales over time. All this information can be found on the King County Parcel Viewer. You enter the address when you get to the site, and it'll bring up a parcel map. The one that's highlighted is Washington Hall, one of Historic Seattle's properties. And when you click on the map, this little window will come up and you can choose to look at the district's report or the property report. Both of those are really important. Looking first at the property report, you can see that it has a lot of information, the year it was built, the size of the building, the size of the lot, parcel data, land data, a lot of the information you'll need, including the parcel ID number and other information that's required on a nomination report. So it's a great place to start and to sort of see kind of some of the basic parts of the property before you get into the weeds on deeper research. And then clicking on that other tab, the districts report here, brings up this page, and it's full of information about an individual district within the county. And if you look where this red arrow is, there's a link you can choose that shows the historical plat map. So I've clicked on that here, and it shows the plat map for Washington Hall on 14th and Fur. You can see that the street was historically called Prince William. So you'll want to download this historic plat map if there's one there to use, and that'll get you started on your neighborhood research. Now I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you. And so sometimes you might find when looking at the parcel viewer, either the district's report or the other property report, the link to that plat map will be a broken link, and an alternative method to find this plat map is the King County official record search. It's not an altogether intuitive tool. It takes a little bit of time to get used to it, but once you do, it can be very useful. For plat maps, you'll need to find the property's full legal description first if you don't already have one, because the legal description on Parcel Viewer is typically abbreviated. And parcel number into the search, as you can see at the top. I have one entered there in the preview image, and then you'll see the property or the search results will come up below, and you can see a warranty deed there. And so you click on it, and you can see it says legal description. I highlighted the piece of information you want in the legal description. They almost always give the volume and the page number on which the plat can be found. And so then you take that and you go back to your search form, and then you select book and page, and then the book type, which is plat book, and then you enter your book and page number all in the highlighted fields. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. I apologize. Oh yeah, one more slide. Sorry, I just ran right through that. So yeah, that was the legal description, and now we're on the search here, where we have the where you enter the plat book and the page number. So so yeah, you enter that, and then you get the search result, and it shows at the bottom there. See how it says document type plat and whatnot. So and even sometimes this. Oh yeah. So even sometimes the King County official record search with this search for the plat map might not turn up the map for whatever reason. And if that happens, just contact the King County Archives, and an archivist will be able to assist you further in finding it. All right, next slide, please. Okay. And yeah, I believe this one's back to you, Jeff.
So one great resource that we have in King County is the Washington State Archives, the Puget Sound Regional Branch at Bellevue College. They have all the historic tax rolls for the county from 1866 until the 70s, basically. And the best sort of, you can do research here in person. You can also do some research online. You need the parcel number to do the research, but the greatest thing that we are able to get from this is the property record card from 1937. This is Washington Hall, the 37 property record card. And this was a WPA project in the Great Depression, and the county actually photographed every property in the county. So we have these amazing photographs from that period. At that time, on much of the city, the trees were not grown up, so these photographs are really clear. You can use them to help describe the buildings. We usually grab the best scan possible of these photographs because they're really beautiful images. They're full of detail and very rich. So the property record card actually has a lot of really important information as well. You can see the building structure. It shows what the building type was. Building materials, what it was built of, the heat system originally, the exterior materials. It was owned by an entity called the Seattle Lodge, which is the Danish Brotherhood. Other features often has the builder, the architect, the owner, really a wealth of information from that moment in time, 1937. Can help put the property sort of into its historic context at that time.
Okay, and in some cases, a digital scan of your property's 1937 record card will actually already be available online at the Washington State Digital Archives sites. And here you simply need to select the Real Property Record Card series and enter either your parcel number or address. And earlier scans were done in black and white, while more recent ones are in color. And as I understand it, all of downtown Seattle and SoDo and much of Capitol Hill and downtown Bellevue have already been scanned. And I know for a fact that the plats of Nagel's first and second edition on Capitol Hill are in color, which is pretty cool. And the one thing I actually want to quickly note here too is that there's the 1937 property record card, but there's also the property record folio, which typically covers roughly post 1970 updates to the property. So anytime that there was like a major addition or change to the property, they would come back and take a photograph of it and just give any sort of updates and enter a new card. And so that's an additional one that you would have to go to the physical archives and request to see. But I just kind of wanted to quickly mention that because that's just another one that's also really good to get your hands on if you can. And back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
So it's important to try to obtain architectural drawings for your property. Many of them can be found, but often the resources in Seattle, especially during the early 20th century, were built from there were builder homes built from plan books or kind of like stock plans. So it's kind of an interesting. There are interesting contexts related to this as well. The photograph in the upper left is sort of the typical Seattle box. It's a unique building type to our city, and they were often built from plan books. This is the cover of a plan book, actually published by the architect of Washington Hall, also Victor Voorhees. And you can see inside the plan book there is a photograph of a house very much like the one in the photograph. And you can also obtain representative floor plans this way from the plan books. So it's surprising how many properties in Seattle actually were built from plan books. So you can often find information about the original layout and floor plans from those. The series of photographs at the bottom of the slide was part of an advocacy effort for Historic Seattle to save C&P Coffee, which is a coffee shop in West Seattle. And through similar research, we discovered that this property was actually the sales office for a district of bungalows, a neighborhood of bungalows, and it showed up on the cover of Bungalow magazine. You can see here. And in the next photograph, the historic photo, you can see the original sort of pilasters are still out front by the sidewalk. And from that, then we could also obtain the floor plan, the original floor plans out of the Bungalow magazine book. So two different ways of kind of looking at buildings that may or may not have floor plans available to you.
All right, and then another source for records on properties such as permits starts here with the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspection website. Much of what you may be looking for might already be here, and if it's not, there's a good chance what is here will tell you where to look for the rest. Also, when searching for your property here, it is good to keep in mind possible variant addresses, especially for properties on a street corner. So as you can see how I entered in 3831 Stoneway North, and all these examples of historical microfilm permits came up. And so like an alternate address that you could enter on it could be 3833, or it could even be 39th Avenue as well, because this property in particular is right on that street corner. So sometimes they enter things in on the different street if it's on a corner. So next slide, please. And then here you have what gives the information about their physical location. Of course, it's temporarily closed because of the pandemic. Normally, you would go in and ask for the records here, but since they are closed, I highlighted here below, you have an email that you can contact them at, and they're usually pretty quick at getting a request fulfilled. Sometimes they're busy, but usually not too busy. And after doing the initial online search described in the previous slide, there's a good chance you will still be looking for original construction permits or early subsequent permits. Roughly speaking, most pre-1950 permits haven't been scanned yet and retrievable online. So those are the ones you're probably going to be emailing the office for. Next slide, please. And so then we have here some examples of some of the records you might see. And on the left, you have a construction permit, and on the right is a permit index card. And permit index cards typically come up in that online search that I mentioned earlier. They'll list out when work was done, offer an abbreviated description of the work and a permit number. And any permits listed on this card you couldn't find online, you can ask the microfilm library staff via email to find for you. Next slide, please. And then here's an example of types of drawings and plans you can get from SDCI. This is specifically the Royview apartments on Capitol Hill. And unfortunately, due to pandemic restrictions, requests for drawings and plans via email are currently limited to the first 20 images that they see, regardless of what they are, and the quality will vary considerably. So we're really hoping that the office will reopen soon, so that when you want to get the plans and drawings, you can go in there and you can look at the microfilm slides and you can specifically pick out which ones you want, and they'll scan them for you. And another quick note for future post-pandemic reference, you can often get better quality images in person by photographing the screen of the microfilm projector rather than asking them to do PDF scans. Sometimes it just depends on what the quality of the microfilm is. So, yep, and next slide, please. And then for the advanced researcher, and I apologize, I think Zoom kind of reduces the quality a little bit here. For those looking for a challenge, this is what's known as the property abstract. It is an index of all property transactions, and these are great for determining chain of ownership. They are organized by the plat name and the block number, as you can see at the top of the sheet. And so basically your property will appear on the sheet in the same index pages as some of the properties nearest to yours. And the trouble with these is that they're often very faded, as you can tell, and they're written in small and abbreviated handwriting. So they are not always, complete. So, it just kind of depends on what you get. And it can take a lot of time getting used to reading these. And yeah, as I said, they typically look a little better than they may look on your screen, depending on the quality of the internet connection we have here. So I apologize for that. But yeah, so that's another option that you have available. And I'll send it back to Jeff.
Sorry, Tom, I was a little premature there.
That's okay.
So at this point, you probably have a lot of information. You may have drawings. You may have at least know who the architect and owner was, and probably what the use was of the building. So at this point, you can do sort of more specialized research, looking into special archives and other collections that may be unique to the building type or the architect. The drawing or the photograph on the left is NARA, National Archives and Records Administration. And essentially any records related to any properties that were currently or previously owned by the federal government would have records there. You can often find great photographs and drawings there. The drawing on the right is from University of Washington Library's special collections. They have an architectural drawing collection, which is really amazing and huge. Many architects in Seattle would donate their collections to the library. And so this is a drawing by Robert Reichert for his version of a Space Needle for the top of Queen Anne Hill. So you can find a lot more kind of unique contextual information and kind of how architects worked, and sort of it's a more broad, sort of moving more broadly now into other sort of contexts rather than just the drawings and legal information. But there's a lot of great, there are a lot of great archives out there to go to. Another great resource is the 10th floor of the downtown Seattle Public Library, the Central Library. The Seattle room has a wealth of really interesting information that you could easily spend a full day here doing research. And I will show you some of the information that's available to you. We're getting now into more kind of researching the human stories that help make historic places meaningful. And as you start to do this research, it's important to kind of keep your biases or be aware of your biases and try not to let them influence your research. You're going to find there's a whole lot that you don't know about the property, even though you think you may know the most salient parts. So at this point, we're trying to do complete and really deep research, telling the full story of a property and obtaining significant personal stories, biographical stories, doing social cultural research, which reveals or which allows us to have a really complete record if we're doing a nomination report or for any research. This is the Polk directories, Seattle City directories. And thanks to Capitol Hill Historical Society, Historic Seattle now has a selection of Polk directories in our library at Dearborn House from 1937 to 1996. And we're excited to be able to make these available, and we're determining how to do that, but we'll make the Polk directories at Historic Seattle available to researchers, so stay tuned. The way you use these directories is you would look up the name of somebody related to your building, could be the architect, the owner, and provide, from the 1917 edition, for example, this is the book, these are the shelves that it's located on in the library. And I just, on a whim, looked up my great-grandfather, Frank Smith. His wife was Anna Enemark, a Danish immigrant. He went by Annie, or she went by Annie. He worked as a ship joiner, and the address was just around the corner from Washington Hall. So Washington Hall is the Danish Brotherhood, and they provided a lot of sort of social support to Danish immigrants in the early 20th century. And my relative was one of the people who benefited from that. There's another directory on the 10th floor of the library. It's this sort of nondescript gray book. We think it may have been adapted from a telephone directory, but the title of the volume is House and Street Directories from 1928. And it's actually a reverse directory. It allows you to look up an address and find a person related to that, the person who was the resident or owner of that property. So in this case, I've looked up a property on Minor Avenue, 1117 Minor, which is the address of Dearborn House, Historic Seattle's offices. And in 1928, the date of the directory, the occupant was J.T. Campion. And then, of course, I went down a rabbit hole. Who is J.T. Campion? From that time, I looked in I actually just Googled his name and found an obituary in the New York Times from 1930, 2 years later. It stated that he was a capitalist who came to Seattle to take part in the Yukon Gold Rush, and that he then owned a coal mine in Cedar Creek and eventually retired as president of the Seattle Malting and Brewing Company, another great landmark in Georgetown. So then I also looked at the 1920 census, and sure enough, he showed up as living at Dearborn House, 1117 Minor, with his wife Mamie, his 23-year-old son Cyrus, and their servant, who was a Swedish immigrant and who spoke Swedish. So from these directories, we're able to actually begin to craft a narrative related to the people who are associated with the landmark. And that's so important to be able to do that.
Okay, and then a little bit more about city directories and whatnot. Another good online source for alternative to Ancestry, which has a digital, backing up a little bit here, Ancestry.com, which has a pretty large digital collection of Polk directories, doesn't actually have the 1923 edition. So thankfully, there was a website called distantcousin.com, which is no longer in existence. And it provided a copy of the 1923. And thanks to a tool called the Wayback Machine provided by archive.org, you can access this directory anytime from any computer. And basically, Wayback Machine is a tool that periodically takes snapshots of websites and archives them. However, sometimes some of these snapshots aren't always reliable. So basically, you would just kind of keep picking a different snapshot of this particular city directory until you get one that works correctly, and then you just kind of roll with that. So this is a good way just to get quick access to the 1923 if you need to. And then another thing before we move on, that it's important to note that the 1923 edition isn't the only one that's missing, or the only thing missing from the Ancestry.com Polk directory collection. Starting in 1936, their digital scans do not cover the full alphabet and often exclude business directories, and they exclude all reverse directories from 1938 onward. So while you certainly can do a lot of research online, especially if you have an Ancestry account, or if you go to the public library's physical location and use their computers and use their Ancestry account, but these limitations that these digital sources have is what really makes a physical collection at the Seattle Public Library and now at Historic Seattle, as described by Jeff, such a vital asset to your research. And next slide, please. And then for Native culture in Seattle, as we know, Seattle and the region were inhabited for thousands of years prior to relatively recent arrival of European and North American settlers. There are many resources available that have documented in great detail the history of Seattle's indigenous people, such as the Water Lines Project hosted by the Burke Museum on their website. It has a map with locations and descriptions of areas known for indigenous activity or settlement. Next slide, please. And then there are also books such as Native Seattle and Chief Seattle that tell the histories of Seattle's indigenous people in narrative form, which you can find online and in local bookstores. Next slide, please. And then for further research on buildings and people related to the property, there's also census records, which you can get at Ancestry, which is, like, as I said, accessible from the Seattle Public Library or within an account. You can even get a free 1 to 2 week trial account with Ancestry if you just need something really quickly. They also have the city directories, as I mentioned. They have marriage, death records. They also have probate records, which is, you know, wills and things like that. You can also find newspaper articles which have things about architects and builders and residents of properties all over the place. Seattle Times and the Seattle PI historical archives are online and available from the Seattle Public Library's website. And you can also get architects' biographies on the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation website, as well as Dokomoma Wiwa website. And then there's all sorts of books on specific architects, or there's even Shaping Seattle Architecture, which is kind of an all-encompassing book that has bios on architects all over, active all over Seattle. And there's the College of Built Environments Library at University of Washington, a good source for architecture books. And then there's the Avery Index to Architectural Periodicals available at the University of Washington College of Built Environments Library. Next slide, and I'll give it back to you, Jeff.
Thanks. So discussing a little more deeply on census records, which are really full of great biographical information, useful for researching the owner, the architect, any people associated with a property. And we looked at records for Victor Voorhees, the architect of Washington Hall. In the 1880 census in Cambria, Wisconsin, Victor Voorhees was 4 years old. He lived with his father and mother, Victor and Violetta, and his sister Blanche. His father was a painter. And then the 1910 census, which is shown here on the left, shows that Voorhees was 34 years old. He was married. His wife's name was Phoebe. She was 25. His profession by then was architect, and it shows his address in 1910. Finally, in the 1940 census, Voorhees was 64 years old. He was married again, apparently. His wife's name was Monty. She was 26. Their daughter and his nephew lived with them, and he was an architect who owned his own practice at that time, and they lived at 423 Halliday Street. So we're able to sort of begin to craft a story about Victor Voorhees from these sort of very dry looking records, but they're really quite rich, in fact. Looking more deeply at neighborhood context and development, the Historic Preservation website, Department of Neighborhoods online, has various city context statements, which are really useful to delve into the direct history of the neighborhood where the property is that you're learning about, kind of the development history of different neighborhoods. So that's a good way, if your neighborhood is included, to get some of that information. There are books that are specific to certain neighborhoods. Neighborhood branch libraries often have them, as well as the central library. Pioneer Square, Seattle's oldest neighborhood, is the one on the left. The Hill with a Future is about Capitol Hill. And then Queen Anne Historical Society published Queen Anne Community on the Hill. So there are specific neighborhood related resources that you can locate. There's a wealth of information on HistoryLink. Historic Seattle recently did an online tour with HistoryLink of First Hill. So there are neighborhood-specific resources through HistoryLink, both articles and tours that are helpful to learn about your neighborhood. And then below here is, again, from the Department of Neighborhoods Historic Preservation website, there is a list of landmarks available. You can find a landmark kind of in your neighborhood and get a ton of information from other landmarks that describe the neighborhood context. So it's another good resource for learning about the development of neighborhoods. Now back on the 10th floor of the Seattle Public Library, the Seattle Room. This is a resource called the Architect's Card File. And the cards are organized by architect name. And so any articles that may be associated with a certain architect, it's kind of an obscure resource, but if you kind of wander through the aisles, you'll find it. And sometimes you'll find articles that aren't shown in other locations. This is Victor Voorhees. It's a notation about an article on the Joseph Vance building that was published in the book Buildings by Design. So it's kind of a potluck of information. You never quite know what you're going to find, but you can find things here that aren't available elsewhere.
And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but to kind of go a little bit deeper, there's obviously newspaper research, and there's a whole variety of newspapers available to you, a lot of which have been digitized. And if not digitized, you can certainly go into the Central Library and flip through the microfilm that they have. And as I already mentioned, Seattle Times, Seattle PI, and there's other ones such as Seattle Mail and Herald. You can find that on the SPL Digital Collections online site. There's the Seattle Star, and that's free online through Chronicling America, which is a Library of Congress project. And there's also the Seattle Republican and Caton's Weekly. That is a Black newspaper by Horace Caton, and he was the editor and did much of the writing along with his wife. And yeah, they have this available on Chronicling America as well. So that's a great resource. And then another Black newspaper in Seattle, the Northwest Enterprise, is available from 1931 through 52, also available through Chronicling America. And this is just a small selection of some of the different publications that you can find, some of which are already digitized, some which are in microfilm form in a local library near you. And next slide, please. And then there's also trades and arts publications that you can get access to as well. There's the Daily Journal of Commerce. Those, I believe, are only available at the Central Library. There's Pacific Architect and Builder, Pacific Builder and Engineer. Most of those, again, are only available at the Central Library. There might be some Pacific Builder and Engineers on the digital collections website for Seattle Public Library. And there's also the Town Crier, which is an arts magazine for Seattle from 1912 to 38. That can be found for free online at the Seattle Public Library digital collections site. Next slide, please. And then I was wanted to dive a little bit deeper in kind of the how-to, some quick tips when doing research, because it's great to know what the tools are, but it's also really important to know how to use them. Because you can try to type in a search term and get really overwhelmed by what the search results are. And it's really good to narrow that down a little bit. And so in this example, I'm using what is actually a subscription service called Genealogy Bank. And the reason I'm using this one is it's a little bit easier to display on a slide. And it's one of the more robust tools available. I find it a little bit more effective than the one available by Seattle Public Library, but you can kind of adapt what I have here to that as best as you can. And so take, for example, the address of 534 15th Avenue East on Capitol Hill. The best way to search for it is not just to simply enter the address, but by using quotation marks. And so see how I entered 534 15th in quotes? It's a shortened version of the address because you want to try to give as little information to it as possible. So it's not too specific, but you also don't want it to be so broad that it gives you everything. And so this tends to be what I found is the kind of the sweet spot for searching for an address. And then other alternatives to this, might be actually spelling out the word 15th. So instead of using the shorthand, you actually spell out the full word. Another thing could be using alternate addresses, such as instead of using 534, you could do 532 or 536. Or alternately, you could search an intersection. And that's what's great also about Genealogy Bank is that they have the first and last name. You could add 15th and Mercer into the search fields, and it finds instances in which those two words come close together. And Chronicling America has a tool very similar to this, so that's free. And they have a field where you can enter individual search terms, and it finds instances in which they come within 5 words of each other. So very, very helpful tools for finding things that you're looking for. And a similar process applies when searching for names. So take my own name, for instance. You can put my name in quotes. So Tom Heuser in quotes. It could be Thomas Heuser. It could be Thomas G, Tom G, or even T.G. Heuser. And then you could even do alternate spellings such as like H-A-U-S-E-R instead of H-E-U-S-E-R, because sometimes they misspell names in newspaper publications, or they just do a typo or something like that. Happens all the time. So those are some quick tips for doing some newspaper research. And next slide, please. And then kind of going back to the sort of physical collections at the library, there's some other useful resources, which is the Northwest Subject Index, which is a card catalog that tracks source materials in the library related to a whole variety of subjects. So if you're looking for things, say a specific city or town in Washington, or things about certain building types or uses, or any other types of categories, this is a good place to look. And then you pull out a card, and basically it'll tell you what whoever put the cards together, things that they found related to those categories in the library's collections, and then it would tell you where to find it. Next slide, please. And then there's also some document boxes that contain various clippings and ephemera on architects and buildings that have been collected over the years. These boxes are by no means comprehensive in terms of all buildings and architects in the region, but they can still be helpful to useful to some researchers in certain cases. So it's definitely good to ask about these as well when you're at the library. Next slide, back to you, Jeff.
All right, so continuing on the 10th floor of Seattle Public Library, there are a variety of publishers of insurance maps. The Sanborn Map Company is one. It was a subsidiary of the Hartford Insurance Company. They use these maps for underwriting. They describe sort of the building footprint, the type of construction. Basically, it's how flammable it was, wood frame versus masonry. They're really interesting books and quite beautiful to look at. This is an image here of the West Seattle High School, which the original building shows up in pink on the map. It's obviously masonry. This is the key to the different types of construction at the top of the page there. The olive color was also a fireproof construction, but not masonry. And then another type, it also includes information. There are lots of symbols within the map that include building height, where windows are and what types of windows there are. There's lots of information kind of found in this very detailed key. Based maps are another, another manufacturer of maps. Also similar. These are images from the 1908 based map, which is located on the 10th floor again. I'll note that you can also get the 1905 version online at Seattle Public Library Special Collections, and the 1908 is also online. Some years ago, Paul Dorpat scanned and put them online for people to use. The 1908 map is that one. So looking at the 1908 map, we can see that this is again the location of Washington Hall, 14th and Fur right here. It's kind of interesting to note that there's a baseball park with a very large structure there. It kind of gives you a point of reference. These are the parcels related to Washington Hall, and you can see that at this time nothing had been built yet, so it would be built very soon. These are the explanations, the key to these maps. It shows that pink is a brick masonry building, but in this neighborhood it's mostly wood frame buildings, and you can see that the neighborhood is sort of sporadically developing, beginning to become more dense in certain parts. So this is the 1912 base map. Again, you can see the baseball park here. And then Washington Hall in this map has been constructed. And just up the street, there's actually a masonry building called the St. George. I believe it was an apartment building. And this map is also available online through Paul Dorpat. Finally, this is a Kroll map, another manufacturer. This is from around 1940. And you can see Fur and 14th up here at the top of the map. Washington Hall again shows up. And at this time, the baseball park is actually gone. So a lot more dense development. The keys to the Kroll maps are a little different. The hash or hash marks on the buildings indicate that they are masonry. And buildings that are not hashed are wood frame buildings. So you're able to then sort of tell a story about the development of a neighborhood using these maps, kind of the quality of construction, how large the buildings are. You can tell a lot about the infrastructure that's in the maps as well. You can see that the key to the Kroll map provides, you can see where the streetcars run, where certain kinds of public resources are. So there's a lot of information that can tell about the sort of the development and the changes in the neighborhood over time. Back to Tom.
And then, another very useful map that I found kind of early on in my research when I kept getting confused about where, when, and how street directionals changed. The city provides this nice color-coded map. And in 1961, they changed the north, south, west, east, and so forth, street directionals, just to kind of make the system make a little bit more sense. So for instance, on Capitol Hill, the north south running avenues, such as like Summit Avenue East, which we understand is Summit Avenue East now, Melrose Avenue East, things like that. They used to be Summit Avenue North and Summit Avenue East until 1961, and then they changed it. And that's just one example. There's other ones, as you can see here, the different color codings that show that things change. So if you're getting confused and trying to find your address in a certain time before 1961 and you're not finding anything, it's probably because the street directional changed for your property. So this is a very helpful tool in determining that. Next slide, please. And then another useful map, if you need to resolve any questions around when and how your property was annexed to the city. If you hover your cursor over the list items on the right when you're visiting this site on your own, the corresponding section on the map will light up and you can click on the item to zoom in on that section of the map, and you can even download a scanned copy of the original annexation ordinance. So you can see all the text that wrote up the description of the annexation process and everything that was entailed in that. So that's another really cool tool. Next slide, please. And then also note well that much of the city's street names changed in 1895 to clear up a lot of the confusion caused by the platting system, because when people filed plats for a certain section of land, they would give their own names to the streets within the plat. And so when you would be on a certain plat, you'd be driving or walking on a street, you go to the next plat, suddenly the name would change. And this would happen all over the place throughout the city, causing a lot of confusion. And so in 1895, they basically standardized all the street names. And so luckily there's a map, as you can kind of see this sort of preview image here, that is available from the Seattle Municipal Archives, that shows all the old names crossed off and the new ones written in. I believe this is a sewer map, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so that's really helpful. But even better is another local historian, Rob Ketcherside, has on his own website, and the URL here, he took this data from this map and created a searchable table. So you can enter in your street and find out whether that it used to have a different name prior to 1895. So it's a very helpful tool. Next slide, please. And then there's also the history of redlining and racial covenants. That is very important, but very often goes untold. And there's also a major lack of landmarks in redline neighborhoods. And so And this is something, obviously, the field of historic preservation has been working proactively to address. And this particular tool is very helpful to that end. And for anyone wanting to research whether any racial covenants were placed on their property, this is a great place to start at the University of Washington's website. It's an interactive map that tracks which properties throughout the city had racial covenants, and even better, it gives the exact wording of those covenants. So you can zoom in, you can click on the property, and then on the right-hand side, you can kind of scroll through the list of what the text of that covenant was. And also, just generally speaking, the broader Civil Rights and Labor History Project has a wealth of contextual history for these covenants. And you can also get access to more specific newspapers and things like this, like labor newspapers and things like that, that you might not immediately find from the Seattle Public Library. So this is a very great resource to check out and reach out to the people who run it. Next slide, please. And back to you.
All right. So obviously one of the best ways to tell the story of a property over time is through photographs. And we're lucky to have quite a few online resources for finding historic photographs of individual properties. This slide shows the University of Washington Library's Special Collections site. They have, you go to their digital collections page, and there are multiple collections of photographs of different subject matter and buildings. This one's showing architecture of the Pacific Northwest. There's also just general UW archives related to the university. There's the Washington State Jewish Archives. There's all kinds of archives showing that are photographs held by special collections. And it's a great resource to search for a photograph. Also MOHI, the Museum of History and Industry. Many of their photographs are online and easy to access. And it's actually where I seem to have the most luck in finding historic photographs of individual buildings. So definitely have a look at MOHI. The Seattle Municipal Archives has an archive online. You can search for different, much of the content is actually sort of describing the infrastructure of the city, public works. So you'll often find images of buildings in the context of a street project or a streetcar project, but that can also kind of help to tell the story of when things happen in a certain neighborhood. So it's always good to look at the municipal archives. Finally, Seattle Public Library has a special collections feature online, and you can obtain quite a few both sort of historic context as well as buildings, different things happening in the city as well as locations in the city. And so it's really important to look through all these resources to try and capture as much visual content as you can for your report, because it really helps to describe much more clearly often than text, or for sort of a layperson looking at a historic report. So definitely try to obtain as many of the historic photographs as you can.
And then also it can be helpful to search the photographs for photographs in other regional digital collections, such as the Tacoma Public Library. They have a considerable amount of historical photographs of Seattle, so don't be afraid to broaden your search and check out other regional collections that they may happen to have something that you're looking for. Next slide, please. And then here's one example of a building that had multiple photographs available from multiple sources. This is the Booth Building at Broadway and Pine, which was the original location of Cornish School. And having all of these photos is just a great way of helping tell the history and showing how a building has changed over time in its use. Next slide, please. And then moving on to a different source, ebooks and periodicals. As I talked about before, archive.org is also a great source for these. They basically have a huge digital collection of scanned resources from all over the country. And so here we have the history of Seattle. This is a book that, typically you may have had to go to the reference section and on the 10th floor of the public library, but now it's keyword searchable on archive.org, and it provides a wealth of information about Seattle's early history. And next slide, please. And then another great source for ebooks and periodicals is hathitrust.org. They're a very similar structure to archive.org. They just have scans of books and magazines and other publications from all over the country in different libraries. And one that was really cool that I came across is cartoons and caricatures of Seattle citizens. So if your property happens to involve somebody who is on this list, you might be able to get some good biographical information about them. Next slide, please. And then another site that's not quite as broad as the other collections, but may have something you're looking for. It certainly has helped me in the past. There's familysearch.org. I believe Ancestry owns this, but you can sign up for a free account that gives you access to the ebooks and periodicals. So this is another potentially helpful tool in your search when you're looking for things about people associated with your properties. And I want to add one bonus thing that isn't a part of this presentation, but I remembered sort of more before or just after getting this all together. Another really great resource that I kind of want to sneak in here is the King County Superior Court. So if you come across people that you're doing research and they got divorced, there's going to be divorce proceedings at the King County the King County Superior Court, and you can look through their index. That's assuming when the records office is reopened again, and you can pull the divorce records. You can find tons of information about a property. Whatever was going on with the dispute, you can find lots of stuff. So I just kind of wanted to sneak that in there because that's a very helpful tool. So that concludes the presentation. So here's our contact info. You can reach Jeff at jeff.m@historicseattle.org and his office line listed there. And you can also reach me via email at tom@tgheuser.co. And you got my full phone number there. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook if you want to follow me there. And you can find out more about my background, the work that I do, more examples of my work on my blog at my website, tgheuser.co. And for anyone who needs assistance with research or preparing a landmark nomination, anything of that sort, I'm also available for hire and do offer reduced rates for things for individuals seeking historical information for non-commercial purposes. So that's it. And so we're now going to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Tom and Jeff. That was fantastic. There was so much information in there. They're like, each sentence was like a nugget. And so as you can, and they just sort of, and this is not everything, it's not exhaustive. There's so much more, but this can get you going for your research project, or just if you're just kind of interested in a property or a person. So I was curious if we have any questions. I don't think I saw any in the chat yet.
We haven't had any on chat or YouTube yet, Eugenia. We can give it just a minute if anyone has anything. I see a hand raised. Let me see if I can figure out who that's coming from.
That's from Afua Kuate. Hi, Afua.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is very stimulating to me. It's a lot of information, and I'm glad that it's public information to be had. What my question is what if we do find information on a specific property and we cannot identify the information on there? How do we submit it on the application for approval?
What do you mean if you can't identify the information?
If it's not readable, like if a name, it's like fancy cursive, we can't figure out the information.
Okay. Jeff or Tom, you can answer it, or I can. Do you have a preference?
I can certainly chime in. One thing that I found helpful, because a lot of times I'm unable to read that cursive or blurry handwriting, and I often take it to I take a screenshot of it and I post it to social media, and my friends will help me decipher it. And almost every time that I've done this, I've been able to succeed at this. It's not a guarantee, but that's one thing I definitely recommend doing. And sometimes there's, circuitous ways of trying to identify what you're seeing, because sometimes like you might be able to decipher like the first initial their first initials of their first name and last name. And maybe you can go through a city directory. If you get few of the letters, then you go to the city directory and find something that comes close to it. And then you see something that looks like might be a potential match, and you might be able to identify it that way. There's kind of roundabout ways, but that's what I try to do. So those are kind of some of my tricks of the trade. But sometimes, for some of the reports that I've done, sometimes you just end up submitting a report and saying like, no architect was identified with the project, or could be determined. And sometimes you just have to accept that. Sometimes these records aren't available or they're not legible. But Jeff, did you have any other suggestions for how to go about that?
I was just going to say that it's certainly dependent on the property, but often you're looking at so many different sources and so many different types of information that the research is kind of redundant. You'll get some of the same information from multiple sources, and then you can sort of decipher. You realize, oh, that's the name because it was showing up in some other resource. So that often helps too. And if you absolutely cannot find it, then that's just part of the document too. You reveal that you have the signature that it's not clear, what the name is. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So let's see, there's a comment from Marvin Anderson saying that UW Special Collections has an architect's reference file, a series of boxes with clippings, brochures, and notes. And they also have a card reference file similar to the public library. Definitely, thank you for that, Marvin. I've used these same resources myself. It's been a while since we've actually all been in a library in person, but those are great sources as well. Thank you. Any other questions? You could type them in the chat, or you could raise your hand or just unmute yourself. If not, definitely you have Jeff and Tom's contact info and my info as well. We're always happy to help. For Historic Seattle, just we don't do research for the public because we would end up spending all our time doing that. We are not a library or an archives ourselves. But if it's information that we happen to already have, we're more than happy to share it with you, or we'll direct you to places where you can look for the information. And I included some links on the chat for some of the stuff that Jeff and Tom have already talked about. That's helpful. But yeah. So if there's nothing more, I'm going to turn it back. Thank you very much again. I'm going to turn it back over to Naomi.
Thanks, everyone. And I just wanted to share our sponsor slide, which I didn't realize wasn't showing in the beginning. We have a lot of people who make our programming free and available to the public, not just the ones I mentioned by name. And Rob Larson in particular is part of Trinity Real Estate, who's here on the call today. So I want to make sure that you all recognize that the reason we're able to make these programs available for free in this format is because of these partners of ours who are so generous. So we thank you for spending your time with us today. We hope you've enjoyed the series. All of the program recordings are available on our YouTube channel, and Taylor will follow up after this event with the resources that Jeff and Tom shared and a link to the recording if you'd like to reference it again. If you have any other questions, please do email us at any point, and we hope we'll see you at our next round of programming. Thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you, Tom. Thanks to my colleagues, and thanks to everyone for being here with us today.
Thank you.